Hello. In 2015, Games Workshop cancelled their original fantasy wargame, Warhammer, after 30 years of support, and replaced it with a brand new high fantasy setting and miniatures skirmish game called Age of Sigmar. This brand new IP had a difficult beginning, battered by the lost goodwill of the fantasy faithful, sudden and obtuse managerial mandates, and a design brief that had a seeming disregard for the gameplay experience that would come back to bite it. And yet, the fundamental foundations that were laid down during this troubled creation would help to ensure that it became a strong stablemate for its sci-fi sibling 40k, from whom it would draw a great deal of inspiration. Innovative and unique faction design, magnificent models, and a slowly evolving world and story have done a great deal to win over many, though perhaps not all, detractors over the past 10 years. And the game has laid a strong foundation for fantasy gaming at Games Workshop, continuing to evolve and change in a great many ways. But we're not here to talk about that. No, today we're looking at the beginning. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're exploring the making of the first edition of Age of Sigmar. In my Making Of series, I like to try and find out the development history of the classic games that I love and play. I've currently got series ongoing about Warhammer Fantasy and have just started a 40k series as well. But with the release of Age of Sigmar 4th edition, it seemed like a good opportunity to take a look at the key players involved in the creation of this brand new fantasy world and how it all came together. In most cases, the games that we love are actually a combination, a meeting between the innovation and creativity of writers and artists and designers and the cold hard business logic of managers and investors. And perhaps there is probably no better example of this than Age of Sigmar. This was a game born as an answer to the question, how can we make fantasy as appealing as 40k? How can we retain the best bits of a world we just destroyed and turn them into something that is brand new and exciting and has a forward momentum? To do that, Age of Sigmar would present a new higher fantasy setting where gods walked and fought alongside their people in an endless war amongst the heavens, taking place in the mortal realms, 8 ethereal planes of existence born from the 8 winds of magic, alongside the realm of chaos. The story of the Age of Sigmar would be one of mighty warriors clashing in mythic battles, driven by the efforts of the god Sigmar, deity of a world that was, intent on liberating those mortal realms from the clutches of chaos. At the head of Sigmar's armies marched the Stormcast Eternals, impossibly fierce warriors forged by Sigmar from the souls of the greatest fallen fighters and destined to wage an eternal epic war against the forces of darkness. Before we delve any further into the making of this game, I just want to remind everybody that if you like this video, please do leave a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. And of course, Sigmar's blessings to anybody who wants to check out my Patreon via the link in the description below. Now, there is a lot to be said about Warhammer's end times, and I will be making a dedicated video about that topic. But that video is not this video. No, this one is about the Age of Sigmar, and its story is far bigger than just the end of another game. So I will be touching on the end times here and there for context because that is important, but I'm going to try not to dwell on it too much. If you would like to leave comments to explore that context and how it affected the creation of Age of Sigmar, please feel free because I think that is an important discussion point. But I will ask everybody to remain civil when you're talking about the actual creation of the game, the creators, the people involved, and each other, because we're all passionate about these games and we've all got different opinions, and that's absolutely fine. Okay, that's the end of the age of preamble. Let's get in to the Age of Sigmar. In the winter of 2014, Games Workshop began a series of releases for their former flagship game, Warhammer Fantasy Battles. These would include massive new models like a grandiose take on Nagash, the Nurgle Lord Glotkin, and a monstrously large version of Thanquol's latest loyal Bone Ripper. Alongside these, pumped up new units like the Skaven Stormfiends showed a real-time shift in the landscape of Warhammer battlefields, one populated by bigger centerpiece models and more fantastic creatures and monsters. This trajectory had been seen throughout the 8th edition of Warhammer Fantasy, which I will be covering in another video as well, but the end times shone an enormous spotlight on these enormous models. It was very clear that this was the direction of travel for the Games Workshop fantasy settings. Over the course of 5 campaign books released 2 months apart, the story and setting of the Warhammer world was brought to a conclusion. In March of 2015, the End Times Archaon was released, and Chaos drew final blood in the battle for the Warhammer world. It was a narrative coup de grace for this classic game. Games Workshop was in the midst of a financial upheaval. Pre-tax profits in 2014 had been down 42% on the year before. CEO Mark Wells had stepped down. 40k was doing well, but not well enough to keep the business afloat on its own, and fantasy just wasn't pulling its weight any longer. There was harder and harder questions that needed to be answered. How could you justify investing production time and design and shelf space in a game that just wasn't selling well enough? The opportunity cost was too enormous, and that is why that drastic change was agreed upon. In an interview for my website in 2023, long-standing GW game designer Jervis Johnson reflected on the state of the world as it was ending. I think we all had concerns. You can't spend thousands of hours creating something and not do. But all of the data showed that something drastic needed to be done to save Warhammer. That said, I'd say that it's clear that the execution of the changeover from Warhammer Fantasy Battle to Age of Sigmar could have been handled much, much better. The changes were so drastic, literally cataclysmic, and the message about what was happening and why so vague, that it all seemed very arbitrary and callous. As to whether there are things that I'd do differently given a chance, well, yes, of course there are. But to be honest, I'm not sure if whatever I came up with would really make any difference to the outcome. After all, AOS has gone on to become a hugely successful game and more popular than Warhammer Fantasy Battle ever was, and it quickly changed the downward trajectory of Warhammer Fantasy Battle into an upward one. But what might a drastic change to Games Workshop's fantasy setting actually look like? When I spoke with former head of IP for Games Workshop, Alan Merritt, last year, he shared a few of the thoughts that were circulating.
We went through lots of scenarios about how we might revive the fortunes of the fantasy side of what we were doing, and eventually concluded, well, we need to restart it. We need to kickstart it and give it new life and breathe new energy into it and do something radical and left field. And so there was talk about doing all kinds of different things with the setting to try and introduce things or change things around. And in the end, I thought, well, I'll just take an idea I've been working on for some while, for a few years. I've been working on an idea of the different realms and how of the chaos and how those might become battlefields where heroes and villains of myth and legend walked the battlefields, and where your armies could be anything from the past, the present, and the future of the Warhammer world, and totally blow away all the expectations of what could be an army, and create an environment where you could have anything that you wanted. If you wanted to have flying dwarf steamships, you could put them in there, because you could say that those are from the future of the Warhammer world or whatever. That was an idea I was thinking about having, almost to do like a Warhammer Fantasy Battle Advanced or Warhammer Fantasy Battle 2, kind of a sort of a possibly an epic type format. And I had kind of fleshed out the realms and what they were like. And the idea was that they were like staging posts between the Warhammer world and the actual realm of chaos, that you'd have to travel through the land of Gar to get to the realm of chaos. And yeah, anyway. So I had this idea, and I thought, well, we could do that. And I said, but the problem is that people will still want their Bretonians. And you kind of go, yeah, it will still be trapped by the legacy, because it would still mean, well, I've done all these dwarf steam flying ships, but you still haven't done Bretonian peasant bowmen in plastic or whatever it would. I know we've done those, but or whatever when are you going to do forest goblins in plastic? It's like, well, we're never going to do forest goblins in plastic because we'll never sell enough forest goblins in plastic to pay for the tubing. But yeah, so it was kind of still had those legacy issues. So I put a proposal together that maybe we should just give the Warhammer world a nice narrative conclusion, and then introduce the realms as the new fantasy battle setting. And that was kind of the genus of the idea, really. That was the.
So the decision had already been made. There would be no 9th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Instead, a brand new fantasy IP would be created, and it was going to be essential that it learn the lessons of 40k and rolled those, as well as the best bits of fantasy's lore, into the creation of this new property. It would have to learn a great deal of important lessons to make sure that it was expandable and accessible, that there were stories that could be told and miniatures that could be made on pretty much any scale the designers wanted. The new setting was devised as an ethereal plane, designed to allow for endless war, infinite expansion, and countless factions. Like with the 41st Millennium, this would allow Games Workshop to introduce new locations, characters, armies, models, events, and anything else they wanted at their own leisure, without the restrictions that the Warhammer world had imposed on that kind of thing. Other tangible imports would be sourced from 40k as well. The game would do away with rank and flank combat, instead opting for skirmish warfare. And in another controversial move, the square bases that had become synonymous with Warhammer Fantasy were ditched in favour of 40k's round bases. The reason being that not only did you not need square edges for ranked units anymore, but also the design studio just felt that miniatures fundamentally looked better on round bases. Development of the game had started some time before the end times began, and it had been spearheaded by a small team of Games Workshop legends. GW art director John Blanche was designing new concept art for this world and its factions. Experienced game designer Jervis Johnson was heading up the rules writing, and in charge of the team, of course, was Alan Merritt, the head of IP who we've already heard from. The general sense of the development period seems to be one of a rush to turn around this first version of the game, and an atmosphere in which decisions from management could completely change requirements at the last minute. In a candid interview with Goonhammer in March 2020, former Games Workshop game designer James Hewitt talked about his experience being part of the development team for this new game. So, we all worked on the End Times books, but at the same time we knew that there was work being done behind the scenes, in a locked room, which we were not allowed to go into, but could occasionally peek into. Then AOS finally left the room and came to us. Jervis Johnson had been working on it in the room, so he headed up the rules design, but he was under a lot of pressure from the other people who had been in that room for a long time, where a lot of the decisions had been made about exactly what it was going to be and how it was going to work, and what it would have and wouldn't have. A lot of the decisions that had been made above a rules level, remember, it's miniatures then setting then rules, which then impacted on the rules. The feeling in Games Workshop management at the time appeared to be that the miniatures came first and the games and their rules came a distant second. That by producing a sufficiently impressive model range, you could ensure success instead of having to worry about a rigorously playtested and balanced gameplay experience. Although typically focusing on key business decisions and philosophy, in the 2015 annual note to GW shareholders, then CEO and chairman Tom Kirby did mention the momentous change happening to the Warhammer product line. I do not often talk about our products, partly because I think they speak eloquently for themselves, and partly because it is important for everyone to remember, that's owners, customers, and staff, we are a business. We need to be here next year if you want more of the exquisite models we make. To be here next year, we have to do what all our customers want, not just a noisy few, and find a way of making money doing it. This year, though, has been an exceptional year. Not only have we just opened a wonderful new visitor centre, we have also relaunched Warhammer. The new Warhammer is new. The Stormcast Eternals now bestride the universe and nothing will be the same again. For those who fret about this sort of thing, rest assured, no miniature has been made redundant, no army is unwelcome in the new system, no paint job, no conversion is now worthless. As always, we make these changes with great care. Your miniatures are the real Eternals. Rightly or wrongly, the perspective that miniatures alone were going to be responsible for the game's success led to design briefs and requirements that were going to come back to haunt it. Some of them were, mildly put, regrettable. The first managerial mandate was that Jervis Johnson had to write a rule set that fit on no more than 4 pages, a drive for simplicity and accessibility by making things far less complex than its predecessor, but which also had echoes of the original brief for the very first edition of Warhammer. Back then, the original suggestion was that the rules would be printed on a sheet of paper and included in miniature boxes for free. This time around, they would be released online as a free PDF. In a late change to the plan, a fully completed book's worth of rules, commentary and examples were removed from the final manuscript for the hardcover rulebook that was going to be in the starter box, as it was felt that they would overcomplicate things. Another requirement was the philosophy that the game should allow players to play with whatever they had in their collection. After all, the miniatures that they owned were what was important, not the balancing and the points. So there was no balancing and there were no points. Instead, rules were to be designed to introduce additional texture and variability, but they had to be the same but different. They couldn't be differentiated by points and they couldn't be balanced effectively. So they couldn't be too different. And then, because there was no balancing, because the second of the edicts from on high was that there would be no balancing, no points, when units have different options, we had to make sure they were equal but different. Hammers hit on 4+, wound on a 3+. Swords hit on a 3+ and wound on a 4+, or something like that. It makes no real difference unless you end up with a character that buffs hit rolls, in which case you go with this one. There was some kind of vague synergy there. But generally, we had to make sure that if there was a unit of, say, Empire state troops, sword, spear, and halberd options were all equally good. They just worked differently, because you don't have balancing. As well as the free rules release, there were also free PDFs for the War Scroll Compendiums, a set of rules written by James Hewitt and others that allowed you to field every single army and miniature that was in the current Warhammer Fantasy range. Kirby had been as good as his word on that point. The online War Scroll Compendiums were well received as a concept, and the design of the War Scrolls themselves was also popular. And much like 40k's datasheets, they've gone on to become a key part of the game's architecture ever since. A fan-built platform would later emerge for the creation and management of War Scrolls, and it became so popular that it would eventually be brought in-house by Games Workshop. One of a few community-related decisions that would surprise many over the course of Age of Sigmar's first edition. But whilst the War Scrolls would be a positive addition to the game in the long run, those first set of compendiums included some rules that didn't go down too well, and set a perception for the game that made it seem somewhat unserious. In some cases, fun or highly themed rules were included that made sense or seemed to add some flavour to the game, such as the fact that if a Skaven Screaming Bell could roll 13 on 2d6, they could instantly win the game. On the other hand, Empire players with dramatic facial hair could re-roll failed hit rolls, and High Elf Dragon hosts could re-roll 1s to hit if they could keep a straight face through the hero phase. These, let's call them frothy rules, would quickly fall by the wayside, but they did leave a lasting impression. They would be around for a long time in the minds of many gamers, and they were not the only common complaint. Another one was built around the sparsity of the setting, because it didn't seem to be enormously deep and rich and populated. The world of Age of Sigmar was not a world at all, but rather 8 planes of existence somewhere in the cosmos that were known as the Mortal Realms. The new backdrop would draw some inspiration from the same source materials as the original Warhammer setting and its Realm of Chaos, such as Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion, and the Realm of Chaos itself also survived the destruction of the world that was. The mortal realms were of an indeterminate but enormous scale, populated by both mortal creatures like men and elves, but also home to living gods and legendary beings. Connected together by magical realm gates, each of these realms was given a distinct character in line with the magical energies that had formed it, the same winds of magic that had once blown on Warhammer. The breadth of these realms was of course purposeful. They could allow for any game, any setting, any scenario or terrain or miniature or monster or story to be manifested anywhere in the actual game world. And of course, they also enabled literally endless, unfathomably vast wars to constantly be happening. It was perfect for a war game. Ensuring that the Age of Sigmar was directly tied to the fate of the Warhammer world and that its title made sense, the story of the setting was driven by the god Sigmar. Formerly founder and deity of the Empire, Sigmar survived the destruction and the end times, falling through the void of space for millennia before discovering the mortal realms and their oppression at the hands of the Chaos Gods. An age of myth would follow, with great battles between the impossibly powerful gods across the realms. So the setting made for the perfect backdrop for these epic high fantasy battles between gods and monsters. For Infinite War, it was perfect. But because it was so big and it was so devoid of specific character, specific locations, and specific meaningful stories, that also made it more difficult to invest in. For many, the criticism was that if anything can happen here, does anything matter? These and other criticisms would be things that the game design team would grapple with over the course of the subsequent supplements and editions of the game. But whilst there was not a significant amount of lore and a deep, drawn-out story to start with, that's not to say that there was no effort invested in trying to create a world that had the potential for those stories. In an effort to reclaim the mortal realms from the Chaos Gods and their followers, Sigmar brought together a pantheon of his own gods, including erstwhile enemies like Nagash, and he created a new form of warrior, the Stormcast Eternal, a fully armoured humanoid super soldier forged from the souls of dead and dying fighters, much bigger and stronger than a regular human, and pledged to defend them, despite remaining coolly aloof and unfettered by the feelings, emotions, and weaknesses of those very humans. They were a familiar concept, bearing many of the hallmarks of the extremely popular Space Marines from 40k, and it's not hard to understand why. One of 40k's strengths had always been its accessibility through the easy-to-paint, easy-to-understand, easy-to-play poster faction, the Marines, and the Stormcast could play that exact same role for Age of Sigmar. The starter set for the game included the 4-page rule sheet, a 100-page background book that leaned heavily on art and photography, 2 full armies, and the only things that had points in the box, 2 measuring sticks. The Khorne Gortide featured a diversely named force, including a mighty Lord of Khorne, a Korgorath Beast, a Bloodstoker, a Blood Secretor, 5 Blood Warriors, and 20 Blood Reavers. Opposing these bloody bastards was a force of shiny new Stormcast Eternals, composed of a Lord Celestant, a Lord Relictor, 3 Prosecutors, 10 Liberators, and 3 Retributors. And of course, all of the miniatures in the box came on round or oval bases. In time, the mortal realms would become populated with factions that were inspired by their Warhammer Fantasy ancestors, but in keeping with Age of Sigmar's rock album cover aesthetic, they had the base turned up to 11. Dwarf Troll Slayers would become Fire Slayers, and their engineers would become Caradron Overlords. Wood Elves and Dryads would merge to become the Sylvaneth, and so on. But in the opening stages of the game, all of the pre-existing Warhammer factions were included and categorized according to 4 useful grand alliances: Chaos, Order, Destruction, and Death. Having been burdened by the unfavourable reception to Games Workshop's handling of the end of its predecessor, and the PR nightmare that came with some of the unusual restrictions placed on the game's design by its management, this was not an easy game to launch, and there were probably as many boos as there were cheers when it actually came out. The making of Age of Sigmar had been hard work, but to everybody involved's credit, they did persevere with it. But it had been so hard, in fact, that when interviewed for the book Talking Miniatures, Jervis Johnson had described his work on the game thusly. It was a really difficult task that involved lots of people going round and round the houses in order to edit the rules down to meet that brief. And looking back, I would have to say that first edition of the game was the toughest and least fun project I ever worked on at Workshop. But the story and the making of the Age of Sigmar did not end with that first edition. Far from it, in fact. And just as the game's creation, its design, its development and its deployment had all happened rapidly, so too did its evolution and its improvement happen quickly. So much so that Jervis Johnson would later go on to count Age of Sigmar as one of his proudest works at Games Workshop. Perhaps the greatest, earliest sign of Age of Sigmar's evolution, that it was shifting to become something much greater and more well thought of and more well-rounded than it was when it first launched, would come with the release of a book, a handbook, a general's handbook. The development of this book would bring the community into the design studio. It would bring the spirit of the game back to the table, and it would bring back to the armies their points. But the making of that book is its own fascinating story, as is the continued evolution of Age of Sigmar to becoming the powerhouse it is today. And I'm afraid I just don't have time to do any of that justice right now. So here is where I must leave you. Before I go, I just want to call out and thank a few folks whose work and assistance has been invaluable to me in helping to create this video. The selfless work of Wrinkletooth on Reddit, who has started collating all of the Age of Sigmar releases ever, was just awesome. I've included a link to that down in the description below. It's really, really great to just track all of those releases over time and see how the game changed and evolved. Stu from Miniature Realms has really helped me behind the scenes in getting my perspectives on all of this stuff in line. And of course, I really want to thank the guys over at Goonhammer who continue to do absolutely incredible reporting on the Age of Sigmar. I've linked a couple of amazing articles and their interview with James Hewitt down below. They are well worth a read and always worth checking out. So thanks to those guys. I hope that you've enjoyed this video taking a look at an era not too long ago, but definitely very different to where we are now. Seeing how Age of Sigmar has evolved and changed into what it has become, it's amazing to look back with that perspective on this rocky time in its history, knowing where things would go over time. And hopefully I'll get the chance to explore more of that story here on the channel, and we can see how it changed, how it evolved, and what steps were taken to making it into such a massive success. If you would like to support the channel, then please feel free to check out my Patreon down below. You get early access to interviews. I try and post there quite frequently. I share updates on what I'm doing. And also you get to access the exclusive Discord where we're all having fun chats all the time. It's great stuff. So please give that a look if you're able to. If not, that's absolutely fine. But I really do appreciate likes and comments and shares here on YouTube. And of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. All of that is enormously helpful. I cannot undersell it. It really does help the channel. And of course, if you are going to be buying Age of Sigmar 4th edition stuff this weekend, then why not use my Element Games affiliate link? It's cheaper than going direct through Games Workshop, and it helps me out as well. But that's all of my hard selling. I hope that you have a great time, whatever it is you choose to do after watching this video. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Yeah, the development of the first edition General's Handbook is such an unusual period in Games Workshop's history. I really wanted to cover it in this video, but it's so big and sort of strange that it deserves its own video.